Good morning. Let's go to the Lord in prayer, and we have Alister McGrath with us on the line, and we're going to have a great morning. Father, we thank you for the blessings of this day, the blessings of life, most of all the blessing of Christ and what he means in our lives. We thank you for the blessing of technology, that we can interact and communicate with people on different continents, that we can learn from wise men, that we can be better equipped to serve you. Lord, may we love you. May we be obedient to the greatest commandment. And then may we love others, which goes with it. In Jesus' name, amen. Good morning, Alister.
Good morning to you.
Oh, I'm so relieved to hear that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Alister McGrath. Oxford professor and scholar extraordinaire. And Alister, how many books have you written?
Too many.
Yeah, Alister is one of the most productive people I've ever met. He can read incredibly fast. He can write incredibly fast. He can write incredibly well. And how many books he has written is just constantly increasing. It's like the birth rate, that sort of thing. But Alister's what we're going to do this morning is I'm going to talk briefly with Alister, do a bit of introduction, let him introduce himself a bit, and then he's prepared a video for us about a new book, and I won't say too much about that book because he's going to explain some of it, but the book is titled Narrative Apologetics. But you also have another few books that have recently come out or will be coming out, and we have here some of your books here at the conference, and we're selling them, and we still may have some of them. They've been selling like hotcakes. But I've recently purchased a book you wrote on Albert Einstein, a theory of everything that matters. If you could say just a teeny bit about that and let people know what that's about.
Well, first let me say how great it is to be with you. I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you like this. But this book on Einstein is really saying two very important things. Number one, you can take religion very seriously and be a good scientist. Einstein is a living refutation of the idea that science and religion are incompatible, and that's really important. But the second thing is to say that Einstein was absolutely clear that while science is wonderful, it has its limits. There are things it doesn't do and can't do. For example, talk about the meaning of life or moral values. And what Einstein is doing is saying to be a fulfilled human being, you need science and you need faith as well. And that's really important because Einstein carries cultural authority. And you can use him to make these points very effectively with an audience that, in effect, hasn't really begun to think about these questions.
All right. And then the other book is Richard Dawkins, C.S. Lewis, and the Meaning of Life. You don't frequently hear Richard Dawkins and C.S. Lewis together. Give us a nutshell on that as well.
Well, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we imagined a conversation between Richard Dawkins and C.S. Lewis? Now, it never happened, okay, but what would they say to each other? And so what I do is I pick up the leading themes of their writings and make them talk to each other. And so I say, look, Dawkins says you've got to be able to show reasons for your beliefs. I say, fair enough. Lewis does that. I then make the point that Lewis is saying we need more than science. We need to be able to talk about the meaning of life. We need to be able to appreciate the transformative impact on faith. And what I do in this book is simply map out some areas that are really interesting. And what we found here in England is that people really like the idea of dialogue. It's interesting to have two very different people put in conversation with each other. And this book is a great discussion starter. You give it to a friend, and then afterwards you can follow through and say, well, what did you make of it? Some great questions there. I think it's a very useful book.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be able to talk to you about this theme of narrative apologetics. And obviously, I'm really sorry I can't be with you today. I have so much to do here in Oxford, I just can't get away. And I hope you'll forgive this very informal presentation, which is simply being shot here in my kitchen. And I want to talk to you about narrative apologetics, and I want to try and explain why this is so interesting and, of course, so important. But let me begin by just telling you a little bit about myself. My name is Alister McGrath. I'm the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion here in Oxford. And I used to be an atheist when I was a teenager and converted to Christianity. And I was someone who knew why he was an atheist and knew why he became a Christian. And so for me, apologetics has always been very important. It's about being able to give good reasons for shifting from atheism to Christianity, and being able to step inside an atheist mindset is really very important. I've written quite a lot about this and made lots of videos. You're welcome to look at any of these. You can do this free of charge at my website, Alister McGrath, all one word, .net. But really what I want to begin by doing is to talk to you a bit about why apologetics is so important. And for me, there are three main aspects to this. First of all, engaging cultural concerns and questions. And when people ask you questions like, I would like to be a Christian, but I'm worried about suffering, don't see that as a threat. See it as an opportunity. They want you to talk to them about the problem of suffering and give you a chance to say, here as a Christian is why I think I've got something very important to say about this. Then secondly, of course, is also about setting out the gospel clearly and being able to explain its significance. And I must emphasize the significance bit. Very often we just say, here's what Christianity is, and we don't make the connection. How could the gospel connect up with somebody else's life? You can tell a story, your own story, about how the gospel connects up with your own life. I want you to use that apologetically. And then thirdly, it's about translation, taking Christian words which you and I know so well, like salvation, incarnation, atonement, and explaining to an unchurched audience what those might mean, and also, of course, what difference they might make. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about narrative apologetics. It's something I've come to appreciate as being very important, but I do want to begin by saying this is one approach, not the only one. There are others as well. And what I'm going to try and persuade you is this is worth adding as an arrow to your quiver. In other words, not the only approach, but a really useful approach. Why is it so useful? Well, because it tells stories. The Bible tells stories, and stories are very, very important in Western culture. They capture people's imagination and they make them receptive to ideas. And that to me is a very important point, because Christianity does tell a story. Here's what Tom Wright says. The whole point of Christianity is that it offers a story, which is a story of the whole world. But it's not just telling biblical stories. It's telling stories which invite people to step inside a different world and see what it looks like and begin to figure out whether they actually would like to live there. And one of the points that C.S. Lewis makes, now C.S. Lewis is a very important figure in this lecture, but Lewis makes the important point that Christianity is able to tell better stories than anything in secular culture. Or to use jargon, Christianity can out-narrate the dominant narratives of our culture. It tells a better story. It tells a more truthful story. It tells a more trustworthy story. And of course, Lewis explores this idea at many points. And one of those, of course, is in his Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which I'm sure you've all read. If not, do something about that. But imagine how it opens. Children step into Narnia. It's a beautiful description. And as they explore, they hear different stories about what this place is and what it's all about. And they begin to realize that all of these stories can't be true, that they have to make a decision about which of these stories is to be trusted. And to me, that's really important because, there's a story, Narnia is the possession of the White Witch. It's hers. And then there's this counter story. No, it belongs to Aslan, and one day he's coming back. And when he comes back, everything is going to be better. And the children have to figure out which of these stories is to be trusted, which is truthful, which is trustworthy. And we find exactly that same thing happening in Western culture. Some people tell stories saying, hey, we're just the random output of a random process. But then there's another story, which is that we are beloved creatures of a God who made us and sent Christ to die for us. And what we've really got to be able to do is to show that, in effect, Christianity is able to tell this better story, to, in effect, out-narrate the narratives of our culture. And to me, that is something that we really need to take to heart. So look at this whole question of why stories are so important. One of the reasons why narrative apologetics is so significant is that it's tapping into something that's deep about human nature, which is telling stories. I imagine there are probably some cultural anthropologists in the audience I'm speaking to right now. You will know that stories are universal, that human beings everywhere tell stories to make sense of our world, to figure out what's good, what's bad, to pass on information into their culture. I think that's really important. I want you to think about that because it's very important to realize that no culture is without a story. Ursula Le Guin is a well-known science fiction writer, and she once wrote these words, which I think we need to take to heart. There have been great societies that did not use the wheel, but there have been no societies that didn't tell stories. Think about that. Societies don't use the wheel, but they all tell stories. And that's why people like J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis are tapping into something deep. How many of your friends have seen the movies of The Lord of the Rings and found them enthralling because they are touching on deep, significant questions? And what you need to do is to show that writers like Tolkien and Lewis help us see how stories illuminate reality, help us to figure out what's right, what's trustworthy, and what is good. And here's the really important point. I'm not just saying to you, hey, stories work, let's use them. No, that's true, but there's more to it than that. Because J.R.R. Tolkien argues there is a fundamental theological reason for telling stories. Because the human instinct to tell stories of meaning is grounded in the Christian doctrine of creation. We bear God's image, and that provides a theological explanation for our love of narration. We bear God's image, and that means that we tell stories which somehow keep bringing us back to the story of God. And that's really important. Tolkien talks a bit about the importance of fantasy, in other words, imaginative stories. He writes, fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying we bear God's image, so we tell stories, and the guys out there we're talking to also bear God's image. We can use stories to connect up with them and also to reconnect them with this primal story, the story of God's creation and redemption. And that is so important. The great strength of the Christian narrative is its ability to tell us why human beings tell stories of meaning in the first place. Now, Tolkien has much to say that's interesting, and one of the things he says is that the Christian gospel enfolds and proclaims what he calls a story of a larger kind. Again, a story of a larger kind. And that, in effect, is able to connect up with other stories that we hear told. The Nordic myths, the Greek myths, the kind of big, blockbusters in our culture today. And he argues these can express, I quote, a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium, the gospel, in the real world. So here's the issue that Tolkien is inviting us to explore. Can we look at the stories that people tell and use them as entry points, as gateways for the Christian narrative? I think that's very important. It's very important also because of this transition from modernism to postmodernism. Now, you're probably all sick and tired of hearing about modernity and postmodernity, but let me just make a point that I think is helpful. On the whole, there's a simplification, but a helpful simplification. On the whole, modernity prefers word-based approaches like argument and the logical assessment of evidence. Nothing wrong with that. Postmodernity prefers image-based approaches and sees stories as being of enormous cultural importance. What I want to say to you is that some people you will talk to will want to get involved in arguments. Others will want to hear you tell stories. And you've got to figure out which is appropriate in each case. Remember, apologetics is about identifying your audience. Different audience, different approach. Bear that in mind. So let's imagine that someone were to ask you what reasons can be given for believing in God. Just take a moment and think about that. What reasons can be given for believing in God? Now, one approach I might use would be to provide arguments for God's existence, like the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas, or maybe William Lane Craig's restatement of the Kalam argument, which incidentally is very good. But there's another approach. I could tell my story and tell how I moved from atheism to Christianity, the lines of thought that moved me, and the difference that this made to me. In other words, I'm still talking about evidence and arguments, but I'm telling my story, which is much more interesting than simply saying, here is an abstract argument. Here is an argument that changed my life. Here's the difference it makes. And it reinforces a very important point, which I'm going to emphasize by speaking very slowly. Christianity is not just true, it is real. I say it again. Christianity is not just true, it is real. Now, I want to emphasize that's a really important distinction, because the point I'm making here is that rationalism isn't good enough. It's not enough to show that something is true. We need to show that it's transformative. Not just true, transformative. For example, 2 and 2 make 4. That's true, isn't it? Yes. But is it going to change somebody's life? No. The annual rainfall in the English city of Durham in 1870 was 604.8 millimeters. Isn't that exciting? Well, no, it's not. It's true, but it makes no difference. It doesn't change you. The key point you're making is that Christianity is not just true, it has the capacity to change your life. Not just true, it's real. Now, that's a very important point, and something I think we really need to make very, very clearly indeed. To tell your story of how you came to faith, or indeed how you discovered that Christianity was so satisfying, is telling a story that helps your audience understand that gospel truths are transformative. That the story of God has entered into your story and changed that story. And the key point you are making is very important. This is how my story was transformed by the story of a loving God who made us and redeemed us through Christ. And the implication is anyone listening to your story will possibly be changed by that story as well. So stories really matter. And let me encourage you, you can tell your story. It's a significant story. But I want now to move on and think about biblical stories, the other stories we might tell. And I want to suggest there are 3 main types of stories that we might tell. And all of these are touched on in my book, Narrative Apologetics, which came out recently, and I try in that book to give you a good theoretical foundation, but perhaps more importantly, a practical application of how you tell stories. Biblical stories, literary stories, and cultural or historical stories. Let's look at each of these. First of all, biblical stories. What story might you tell? I very often find myself telling the story of the pearl of great price, the parables. And you can very often, in a conversation with somebody, say, look, let me tell you a story that Jesus told. The parable of great price, or the parable of the pearl of great price in Matthew 13 is very significant because it's about somebody who is looking for something of ultimate satisfaction and has not yet found it. And when he does see that precious pearl, he will sell everything in order to gain it. In other words, he's not satisfied. He's looking for something that will really satisfy. Can you see how you could say that story shows we are all looking for something that really satisfies? Have you found it yet? Or again, we might think of something else. We might talk about the love of God. And you might say, well, how do I describe the love of God to you? Well, it's wonderful. It's so great. It's so great I can't actually describe it because words wouldn't do justice to it. And of course, that is true in one sense, but it's not actually very helpful. Because in effect, all you've said to the person you're talking to is, I cannot tell you what the love of God is like. But you can tell the story of Christ, the passion narrative, Christ laying down his life so that those who he loves might live. Here's Andrea Mantegna's depiction of this just to help you think about this. So think about the death of Christ on the cross and think, for example, about those who were standing around beneath him, mocking him. For example, they said, come down from the cross and save yourself. But you see, he didn't. He didn't come down and save himself. He stayed there and he saved others instead. Now, do you see the point that telling that story makes? The love of God is like someone who willingly gives up his life in order that others might live. That is what the love of God is like. And that is why Christians are so deeply appreciative of the story of Christ. Because it is not simply the basis of redemption, it's a demonstration of the love of God for each of us. Now, I've just told you two very brief biblical stories. There are lots of these. What I want you to do is think about what biblical stories you might tell to begin to connect up with people and move them on. So let's now move on to the second category, literary stories. How might we tell stories or retell stories from literature that might help people? Because people read books all the time. And one of the issues is, which stories do we pick up on that might be helpful? It might be the plot of a movie. It might be something from Harry Potter. It might be, well, you tell me what it might be. The important thing is that you think through what story you might pick up on. I'm going to do one for you to illustrate the possibilities. I'm going to look at C.S. Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I'm sure many of you have read that. The movie version of that actually isn't very good, I'm afraid, but hopefully they'll remake it one day. But anyway, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. In C.S. Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we read of a rather obnoxious character called Eustace Scrubb, a rather greedy boy who, in effect, is turned into a dragon. And C.S. Lewis, of course, knew so well that the dragon was an image of greed in Nordic mythology. He was making the point. Eustace is greedy and hence was transformed into greed itself. You become what you are, and you're trapped in it. You cannot break free from this. And Eustace discovers, to his consternation, he cannot stop being a dragon. He tries to, scratch off the dragon's scales. It doesn't work. He's trapped, and he is terrified, and he is utterly demoralized. He is in a dragon's body. He is a dragon, and he cannot get back to his former self. Who's going to liberate him from the body of a dragon? And then Aslan bounds into the scene. And with his claws, he rips off the dragon's skin. He puts Eustace in a deep well, and Eustace emerges cleansed, transformed, and a human being again. It's a vivid story. It captures the imagination, but it tells us very powerfully about the fact that sin traps us. It prevents us from achieving what we want. It stops us becoming who we are meant to be, and we can't do anything about it. We cannot break free from sin on our own, which is why we need redemption. Now again, I've told that story very, very briefly, and I have to say very badly. And I'm sure every one of you here listening to this could do better than that. You could tell that story better. You could choose other stories and do some wonderful things with them. And really, I'm inviting you to think about doing that. Tell stories, retell stories, and see how they connect up with your colleagues. But of course, there's another point, and that is simply your own story. I've touched on this already. I must come back to this. Each of you has a story that needs to be told. A story that will capture somebody's imagination, that in effect will help them to see that Christianity is not simply something that is trustworthy, but also something that has the capacity to transform. And I want to suggest that each of you present might like to think about this question. You're looking at your own story. What is there in that story that might be of apologetic significance? Is it the story of how you discovered Christianity? Is it the story of how Christianity was there for you when you started going through difficult times? It in effect gave you something that helped you to cope with a very difficult time. What is it in your own story that could be an important apologetic resource? Or you might say, look, I'm giving a talk on why Christianity is so wonderful, and I'm going to talk about lots of things, but unfortunately, my own story doesn't illustrate one particular point, which is the way in which Christianity gives hope to the hopeless. But my friend Peter went through exactly that experience. What I'm going to do is give my talk, and then at the appropriate point, bring in Peter and ask him to tell his story. Change of voice, but the point being made, this is something that changes your life. So what I want you to do is reflect on your story. How can you use that? An exercise I very often used to get my students to do was this. Go through the parables of the Gospels and ask, how could each of these be apologetically helpful? The parable of the prodigal son. That's very powerful. It's a wonderful story, but it talks about the love of God. It talks about the transformation of the human situation. What parables might you use apologetically, and how would you use them? And to me, that really is a very important point. Also, you might think about Christian vocabulary. Remember right at the beginning of this lecture, I said very briefly that Christianity has lots of wonderful words like incarnation, redemption, salvation, atonement. And you and I understand what these mean, but they are jargon to people outside the Christian faith. And again, you could be somebody that tries to help unpack these. Perhaps you could tell your story, how they became real to you, or perhaps you give an illustration to help people see what these mean. I find that is very helpful, and I want you to think about how you might do this. So let me stand back. I'm going to begin wrapping up this talk. What I've been saying very briefly in this lecture is that the use of narratives is culturally intuitive. In other words, people are, in effect, tuned into stories as part of the way we are. And so when you tell a story, they're going to pause and listen because they are wondering where it's taking them. If you have an argument about, for example, the rationality of Christian faith, and you get to point 6 of the argument, somebody might say, oh, I'm sorry, that doesn't follow from point 5, and you lose them. When you tell a story, They're interested. How's this going to end? And they'll listen. And that's a key point. What story can you tell? And that relates to the basic narrative structure of the Gospels and indeed the epistles, as well as so much of the Old Testament. But it's especially important for one particular kind of person. And maybe that kind of person is present in this audience I'm speaking to right now. It's the kind of person who says, I'm not really very good at arguments. I'm not really very good at persuading people. I haven't read Immanuel Kant. I haven't read all these great philosophers. What use can I be? The answer is you can tell your story. Because your story is a witness to the transforming character of the grace of God. And that really is something that you can do superbly. You have a story to deal with, your own story, and I want you to tell it. So in this talk thus far, I've talked about the positives of narrative apologetics, and there are lots of them, okay? And again, I want to emphasize, not the only way of doing apologetics. There are lots of ways, but this is really useful. But what are its downsides? In other words, are there points that narrative apologetics doesn't really help with all that much? I think there are. One of them is very important. Narrative apologetics isn't really that good in dealing with intellectual issues, like, for example, the rational coherence of the Christian faith. It doesn't, in effect, displace argument and evidence-based approaches to Christian apologetics. And that, in my view, is one of its weaknesses, that we need argument to show, for example, let me give you one very simple example, that science and Christian faith are not incompatible. You can give lots of historical analysis, you can give lots of conceptual analysis to show there's no reason why this should be the case. Or you might also tell a story. I might tell the story of Albert Einstein. I'd say Einstein was a very, very famous scientist, and he was absolutely adamant that you had to hold together science and ethics and politics and religion in a bigger vision of reality. In other words, that science and religion, that in effect all the things that matter can be held together. And Einstein is a very powerful witness against those who say science and faith are incompatible. They're not. They're just different. They illuminate different areas of life. And you and I need that different illumination. Science helps us to figure out how our world, and indeed how we, work. But what we need to know is what our world and indeed what we mean. Science gives us a map of functionality. Our faith gives us a map of meaning. And already there you can see I've started to tell stories. I've told you the story of Albert Einstein, and part of his story is holding together science, faith, ethics, politics. In other words, to be a living human being, an authentic human being, you need to hold these things together. I've told you something about Einstein, but there'll be some people in this audience who can say, well, actually, I hold science and faith together. I figured out how to do it. Then you need to tell your story, because that's one of the most effective contradictions of people like Richard Dawkins. Elaine Eklund is a sociologist at Rice University, and one of the points she makes in her recent articles is that what rebuts Richard Dawkins effectively is not so much arguments, but rather being able to point to someone who has integrated their science and their faith and say, they did it, so can I, and so can you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been wonderful being able to talk to you about narrative apologetics. I've very briefly touched on what I hope are some interesting themes, but it needs further exploration. And what I'm saying to you is, there's something here that's really useful. I suggest you test it out, check it out, see how well it works for you, but please, your own story, what is so important about it? How can you use your story apologetically? And also, stories in the Bible, stories in literature, stories in films. How can you use them to connect up with people and allow their stories to be transformed by the greater story of the gospel? It's been wonderful being able to speak to you again. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I hope the conference goes really well. And thank you so much for listening.
Alister, I wanted to ask you a few questions. In the lecture, you mentioned that having been an atheist and knowing the reasons you were an atheist and knowing the reasons that you came to Christianity and committed your life to Christ, you were able to step inside the mindset of an atheist. Well, many of our attendees have never been atheists. They've been raised in Christian homes and been Christians for nearly as long as they can remember. As a former atheist who's able to step inside the mindset of an atheist, could you give us a suggestion or two as to how to speak to an atheist, how to interact in ways that can be effective rather than ineffective?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And let me begin by saying that there's a very important theological point here. And that is that God uses our past histories, our experience, to equip us as apologists. And so in my own case, it's my atheist background that really helps me to speak to other atheists. But in the audience here this morning, each of you has a history, and that history prepares you for some specific ministry. So just try and figure out what that is. In my own case, I used to be an atheist. So for me, there were several things, two main things I want to bring out. One was I did not understand what Christianity was. I had rejected a caricature rather than the real thing. And so one of the things I've learned is that when people say, well, look, I'm an atheist, I couldn't accept Christianity, I'll say, well, I'm so sorry to hear that. Do you mind if we just talk about what Christianity is? And I'll talk about my own story, about how I thought Christianity was simply having to believe some things and act in certain ways, and had completely failed to understand it was about the radical transformation of life through Christ. Very often, by the end of that, they'll say, we had no idea. We thought Christianity was just, behaving in certain ways. We didn't realize there was this really exciting thing lying behind it. So that's the first point I'd want to make. But the second point I think is really important, and it's this. It's that atheists very often are frightened. They are anxious because they know they cannot prove that their own views are right. And certainly I experienced that problem with Oxford University as an atheist who was in the process of beginning to ask difficult questions about atheism. I found myself, in effect, beginning to think, look, my atheism is a faith. I cannot prove it's right. It's not something that is proven to be true. And so if atheism is a faith, well, what's the problem with other faiths like Christianity? And that's one of the points I'd want to encourage you to make. If someone says to me, I couldn't believe what you Christians think, invite them to prove that they are right. They will not be able to do it. And that is very important, because then you say, well, look, I think that really the debate here is not so much about faith versus fact. It's about which is the best faith. And that leads you straight into this great discussion opened up by C.S. Lewis, which is why Christianity is so much better than its rivals and alternatives.
So if I'm understanding you, you're saying don't start with the point of telling them that they have as much faith as you do, that atheism is a faith. Ask them a question which will help them to see that they actually have a faith that can't be proved. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct. If you tell somebody you're wrong, well, that doesn't get your conversation off to a great start. If you say, that's really interesting, let me just take this a bit further. Can you just show me that you are right? In effect, it helps them to see for themselves that they are vulnerable at this point. And that's going to plant doubts in their mind. We need to realize atheists have doubts. And very often, asking them those difficult questions will help them think this through. And if they can't really give you a good answer, you can always say, look, let's talk about this again sometime, because I think we could have a really good conversation about this.
Okay. Well, Alister, I'm going to ask you now to tell us a bit more about your story. And I'm going to ask you to pick up at this point where you changed your worldview. You went from being an atheist to being a Christian. What did you do at that point? What were some influences, resources that you found to build your faith and to ground you in Christian truth then? And then also, what are the resources still today that you appeal to individuals, relationships that keep you grounded and growing as a believer?
I think those are some great questions. I think the first point to make is this. I came to faith with unanswered questions. In other words, I could see Christianity made sense, and I knew it had captured my heart and my soul and my imagination. And I committed myself to Christ. But my questions were not all answered at that stage. And so, in some ways, what I was doing during the first period of my faith was really trying to sort myself out. And my unfortunate Christian friends found themselves struggling to answer some of the questions I was asking them. And then one of them said one day, look, why don't you read C.S. Lewis? And I thought, okay, I mean, I don't know very much about C.S. Lewis. I think he wrote a book about wardrobes or something, but I didn't actually know very much about him. So I went and I bought a book by C.S. Lewis. And it was brilliant. It was actually, they asked for a paper, it's a collection of essays, but some of those essays really spoke to me. And I suddenly realized there's somebody here who knows the questions I'm asking and is giving me answers. Now, I want to say, I'm sure in the audience today, every one of you will be able to point to someone you've read or someone you've heard on tape or listened to on video, and you'll say, these people are really helpful. You need to share those names because it's really helpful in taking this forward. The other thing that I realized is that I really need to understand Christianity better. And in the end, I studied theology, and I found that quite difficult. I was a scientist who became a theologian. It was not an easy transition. But again, I found the help of friends in thinking things through. Very often they would say, I found this paper very helpful, or I found this way of thinking very helpful. And I found myself, in effect, growing in my faith through the help of others. I needed support, I needed encouragement. I think that's something we need to bear in mind. It's hard being a Christian on your own. We're meant to be encouraged and helped to grow by those around us, and I certainly found that very helpful. And now in my old age, I try to do the same myself for those who are coming up in their faith.
Great, great. One of the things that I've always been impressed by with you, and I discovered your work when I was a seminary student at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I was a doctoral student my first year when you came and gave some lectures at Southwestern back in the 90s, and you may not remember it because you've given so many lectures at so many places, but one of the things that I was highly impressed with was how well you balance the academics. You've written highly academic books like your 3-volume Scientific Theology. You've given the Gifford Lectures, but also with practical ministry. And how do you, as an intellectual, keep together these two worlds? How do you bring together the deep thought that's required for academics and also stay grounded and communicate to the average person? Could you give us a tip or two about how you just do it?
Well, I'll give you 2 tips which I think are very important. Number 1 is, on Sundays I preach, I minister. And that means I'm always asking, what does my congregation need to hear? And also, how can I best express this? I need to be able to translate my language into the language of ordinary people. And that's a problem I think many theologians have. They have a kind of theological language which they speak, but not many other people do. And one of the challenges to all of us, I think, is to try and find ways of expressing these ideas in ways that make sense to ordinary people. So that's the practical side. The theoretical side is how you see yourself. What do you see your role as being? I see my role as being someone who really knows the Christian faith, who understands it, and my job is to resource other people to see the same. But I have to begin where they are, not where I am. And very often they don't know very much, they don't understand very much, and my job is, without being condescending, to try and help them grasp material, to try and bring them up to where I am. And I find that very thrilling and very exciting. And if there's anybody in this audience who is thinking of being a minister or a Christian educationist, that is so important. Because what you're doing is you're equipping others to proclaim, to defend the Christian faith. And it seems to me that really is something that we need to do. And it means you need to be able to ask two questions. What do my audience need to hear? And then number two, how am I going to be able to explain this simply, reliably, faithfully, without sounding as if I'm talking down to them? So I try to bear those 2 points in mind when I give lectures or indeed answer questions.